Have you ever looked back at an older painting and thought, I could do better than this? Well, that's how I feel about this Oystercatcher pastel. I made it back in 2015 from my own reference photo, and it hangs in my home and it has been bugging me for a long time. Every time I see it, I think, it's just not quite right. And I don't know, I have a bit of a thing about, well, is it cheating to go back and make your older work better? Should I just leave it as a record of where I was as an artist, and I will move on and I'll create new stuff and I'll make that stuff better? Or since it's here in my house and I could make it better, should I do that? If we haven't met before, my name's Pamela Ruddy. I'm an artist based in the northeast of Scotland, and my channel is about wildlife and landscape art. Now, this painting is for sale, and I'm going to deactivate this listing, because if I start changing it and forget about it, changing the listing, or if I happen to sell it whilst I'm changing it, that would be really embarrassing. So I'm going to delist it, and I will put a new photo up and reactivate it once I'm done. Now, I really like the Oystercatcher, although it's maybe not as bright as I'd like it to be, but I like the Oystercatcher, and I like the foreground rocks and grasses. And I like that the background is out of focus. What I don't like is that the background is very samey. It's very muddy brown all over, and it doesn't really add to the picture. In fact, the Oystercatcher is almost kind of lost against it. And I think we can do better than this. Although I live by the coast and I see plenty of oystercatchers, either in the parks collecting worms or on the mud flats, I actually took this reference photo when I was visiting the Highlands. And I was surprised. I didn't realise that oystercatchers and lapwings and curlews, that they were also upland birds. I just assumed, because I grew up on the coast and I saw oystercatchers on the coast and their name is Oystercatcher, I just assumed that they were a coastal bird, and I didn't understand. So I took this photo of it up there, and I really loved that. But my painting, although the grasses and so on do look a bit like the Highlands, I kind of thought if I had sky coming in, if I could see that there was a slope in the background, it maybe give a better sense of place. I'd called this picture Take the High Road because, well, it's in the Scottish Highlands, and also that idea is a lot of the oystercatchers that I normally see are taking the low road, and I'm sure I've already taken great reference pictures of oystercatchers by the coast that I could use as a kind of counterpoint to this piece. So my idea to improve the picture was to put in some sky, and to put it in so it looks like there's a sort of slope in the background, and to give it more of a sense of place, and so that the oystercatcher stands out a bit more, and so that the background has a bit of variety and looks a bit more interesting, and less of, here's an oystercatcher in a bunch of muddy brown that you maybe don't want in your living room. So instead, I wanted it to look attractive. Since it is mainly hanging in my living room at the moment, I want it to... My first job was to brush off as much of the pastel off the background as possible. I just rubbed it right off. And I wasn't even that careful about the edges of the oystercatcher, or exactly where I was going to be putting this line of the slope. I just wanted to, I blended it out and I pushed all the loose pastel off of the paper and tapped it and stuff to just try and get the surface as clear as possible, because if I just put blue or white or that over the top, that pastel would have mixed with the pastel underneath a lot more. So creating a clearer surface for it meant that the new pastel would stick better and that it wouldn't look too muddy. I could get a bit of a clear sky. So for the sky, I put in layers of blue and white to get a sort of light blue colour. I had to work out roughly where my slope was going. I didn't want it to be too severe, pushing, so that it contrasted too much with this kind of flat bit where the Oystercatcher was. I wanted it to be reasonably gentle, and the next thing I had to do was to not have a harsh line for it, because I wanted it to stay as an out of focus background. And the way that you kind of do that is with blending and kind of putting the sky colour over the grass a little. That helps to sort of push it out into the background. Once I'd created the slope, it was at that point that I kind of thought, well, and it still looked quite zany. And so I thought, well, I just want to give the impression that it is kind of a slope, a bit like the material that the Oystercatcher is on, some rocks and some grasses. So I just really roughly added the rocks. I'd recently completed the waterfall painting, which I'll link to, and in that I had a lot of rocks, so I had a general sense of, how to put in just the impression of rocks, just having, some surfaces that are lighter and mid-tone and shadows underneath that. And really just basic. I didn't even look at a reference for that. And I feel it works fine. I suppose when you are doing stuff without a reference, you are in danger of it looking like it's a generic rock and too cartoony. But for this purpose, it was fine. Okay, after allowing the loose pastel, tapping the drawing to make the loose pastel fall off from doing the sky, which does tend to result in quite a bit of loose dust, I then got out my pastel pencils and tried to refine the details around the Oystercatcher. I had been a bit rough, both when I was brushing off the pastel and then when I was putting in the background. And so I just wanted to refine the details, and I probably made it a little bit brighter than it had been before, and maybe a bit better defined with the pastel pencil as well. Just to sort of reinstate what I'd had before, or maybe improve upon it a bit. So that's it. It was a really quick change. Was it a good idea or not? Well, I don't think it would be good to be constantly going back to old paintings, and like to the extent that it's affecting you creating new stuff. If you're thinking, I have to make everything perfect, I have to keep going back and keep changing them, you want to set a boundary with yourself about what's reasonable. But this one hangs in my home, and I thought about the change I wanted to make for quite a while, and it was a specific change that I felt could improve it, and hopefully it will help me sell it. But I think having a goal in mind, rather than just being constantly reworking and reworking and reworking, because you want to be creating new stuff too. And it's why, even though I had the idea for doing this, when I'd had a bit of a hiatus with my artwork, when I got back into creating artwork, I felt it was important that I created some new work first, because I didn't want to get caught up. Particularly if I made a mess of it, I didn't want to have that feeling of, I messed up. some work. I haven't even started doing new work and I've messed up some old work. So I wanted to feel confident in my abilities again before I tackled doing this. And I'm happy with how it's turned out. I hope you'll tell me in the comments if you have reworked some old paintings and how that turned out for you. If you enjoyed this Oystercatcher painting, you might enjoy me doing this puffin from scratch.